Colleagues, friends, students, members of the audience, welcome to the Architectural Association. This is an event that is meant to be really a convivial event, and we are really happy to host this event, but I wanted to reiterate something that has been said many times during the preparations of this meeting, and that is that this is not an AA event. It's not really just the AA. It's the AA plus many other friends, guests, so many schools joining us today. So we're just playing here out of the middle ground of Bedford Square, and the spirit of this event is really one of friendship and welcoming to all of you. So thank you very much for joining us today. The instigation to come here today that came from our students, Eva, Sahir, Eugene, Kathy, Jack, Noah, and Angelica, and so on, was that we could start thinking together a radical revision of our education. A radical revision of the curriculum, a radical revision of policies, and a radical revision of outreach, of the way through which we collaborate across architectural education. And I think this is really the spirit through which we would like to organize the day. The instigation is also a very simple one from our side, and that is that the contemporary conditions of practice of architectural education face 4 challenges. And these are notes, jottings, yet to be fully developed, in particularly in methodological terms, about what it means to face a new climate regime, a new form of engagement with the Earth. The 4 elements that I would like to discuss a little bit more in detail today are really the elements that are going to be instructing the 4 sessions during the day. The first one, as you see, is the question how to think embedded ecological understanding in architectural education. The second is a question about intersectionality, which is a very big mouthful for an understanding that today it's no longer possible to think that the situations that we are facing can only be referred to a particular condition. We are always intersecting multiple forms of transformation. The third challenge that we will have to think through very carefully is, what does it mean to form a new alliance? What does it mean to form a new politics? What does it mean to form a new grouping? So this is a difficult question. We'll see more in detail. And the fourth one is how to rethink architectural practices, architectural education, from the point of view of unsolvable, unpayable debt. That is the debt of colonization, the debt of slave trade. How do we think that the transformations that we are about to design, about to think and imagine, can surpass that problem? So these are the 4 elements that I would like to address today. And the 4 elements are really connected, we'll see, with the recent history of our practice, with the recent conditions of education, the recent condition of international organization of architecture, with the recent conditions of contemporary architecture. I am also very grateful for the possibility to give this talk today, and unfortunately our childcare didn't allow us to be both in front of the camera today. Anne-Sophie will most probably have to run off to fetch our little son. The it's also an opportunity really to start the first one of a series of conversations that we'll entertain every Monday evening. And we call these conversations Plan the Planet. The alliteration, the sounds, the plan and planet, hides in reality a disjunction, a distinction in trajectories. The relationship between planning, that is to fix, to attain in space and time, to set a clear condition that we want to reach, and the planet, the wandering star, the conditions of transient relations, is really a contradiction. But that contradiction and that inversion of the possibility of planning the planet is at the very center of the rise of the international. It's at the very center of the construction of contemporary architecture, juridical architecture, material structures, the way in which we organize our entire lives. So the planning and the planet, apparently contradictory, are solved or resolved in the 20th century by transforming what was moving into something static. The planet becomes a fixed object, a backdrop, something that we can start operating on. And that inversion makes planning mobile. Planning becomes a way of organizing and managing life, a way of organizing large coalitions, large reorganization of interest, and so on. At the center of this, for us, is a question that is apparently distant from the key elements of architecture. That is, what is a territory? What forms an inside and an outside? What forms the structures of cohabitation? In architectural practice, the very act of building is a territorial practice. You keep someone in, you warn not to enter, and that distinction is a complex one. We tend to think that it's mainly led us to think of stability, of clear-cut demarcations, of relationships that are formally established. But yet territory is an entity that mainly refers to a condition of deterrence, to warn people, not to infer, not to come into what keeps us alive. The key element of this is a meeting on the high seas in December 1941, a meeting organized in secret between President Roosevelt and the Prime Minister of Her Majesty's government, Winston Churchill. And on the December night, they meet just off the coast of Nova Scotia. And in the morning, the image that you see is the prelude for the establishment of what was then called the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter is a first moment of planning the planet. It is a moment through which the idea of sovereignty, the idea of territory, the idea of articulation of an architecture is fixed. It becomes the United Nations. It becomes the way through which a new institution needs to be set up for new nations to participate in it. We have to first decolonize Africa. We have to decolonize large swathes of Asia. We have to decolonize big part of Central America and the Caribbean. And each one of those newly formed nations then can visit New York, can visit this new assembly to plan, to gather together and imagine a new future. The imagination of the new future is interestingly one of architecture. At the very core of the international, there's an architectural project. It's not only Russell's idea of the international style. At the very center of the planning of the planet, that image that so much characterizes the latest part of the 20th century, that is already individuated much earlier than it was actually snapped as a picture. That particular condition comes much, much earlier. And interestingly enough, it starts here, in this room. The way through which we imagine architecture in the 20th century really begins with a young woman entering this room as one of the first graduate students in architecture in Britain. Her name is Jacqueline Turret. She is a crucial figure in the 20th century. She is at the center of every single turn of modern architecture. She reorganized the work of Sigrid Gideon. She translated his entire work in English. She organized every single Congress of International Modern Architecture. She reinvented the career of Konstantinos Doxiadis. She reinvented or made a career out of Buckminster Fuller, and also invented Marshall McLuhan out of an office in Toronto. Now we have this figure. And yet, Jackie is unknown. You'll find her again and again in the footnotes, in the frontispiece of the most important books about architecture in the 20th century, and there's nothing that we really know about her. Was she a spy for the Germans during the war? Was she a spy for the British in Germany, starting to understand how cities could be built? What is interesting about the figure of Jacqueline Turret, and I would like to really place her at the center of an initiative like this, is not only that she's an unknown, heroic woman that needs to be reinstated on the pedestal of the heroes of the 20th century, but I think that the really interesting element in her life is that she was not considered. Exactly like we are no longer considering the possibilities of architecture of planning. So, in a very sad way, her life trajectory starts with an intersection with the amazing work that was being carried out in London at the time, at a moment of rapid colonization or hyper-imperialism of architecture. We're talking about 102 years ago. And ends with a dismantlement of the same structures. Ends in the 80s when the conditions through which architecture could operate internationally with that scale is abandoned. It's abandoned, interestingly enough, in a conference in Dubrovnik, the famous conference number 10 of the Congress of International Architecture, where Team 10 famously stood up and said, no, we're not going to follow any longer the principles of the Athens Charter. We're going to radically modify it. What is usually not looked at in that conference, at the transition between the modern architecture, modernist organization of the conditions of life, is that there was a huge fight around one term: habitat. What is habitat? That was the theme of the 10th Congress. Is it something simply more than the cities and the regions that Le Corbusier was imagining? Was it something more related to social life that we had to somehow bring in, as the Smithsons would say? Was it something to do with the relationship between architecture, modernization and history? That particular word, habitat, with its resonance in architectural history, but also in biology, also in the organization of ecology, somehow is the moment where architecture splits. And the AA, among other organizations, takes a clear decision. We're no longer interested in Jacqueline Turret. We're interested in the reorganization of semantic architecture, and the organization of architecture as a much closer condition of the ambiguities of language and the ambiguities of living together. It's a particular moment, and I would like us to take the challenge to maybe revisit, for those of us who are interested in revision of architectural education, maybe that is a very good moment to start, and I would like to invite you to look at those conditions. Jacqueline Turret was a phenomenon. She organized new cities in India, new cities in Africa, villages in Asia, reorganized collaborations. She was the first woman that was a secretary of a department of the United Nations, and nothing is known. This is an interesting moment for me to maybe remind us that some of the elements that we are discussing today, the climatic regime, the new climatic regime, the environmental catastrophe, were somehow already discussed. So we are in a sort of déjà vu. We've been here before. And this is what our friend Anselm Franke calls the Anthropocene déjà vu. It's a moment of recognition of something that we've already seen. So it's not something new. We've been here before, but something is at odds with what we thought we would recognize. So the second challenge that I'm posing here, that of imagining a new form of planning, a new form of polity, is really linked to the possibilities of, for instance, Konstantinos Doxiadis' Ecumenopolis, or the very complex making of modeling and calculus that is at the very heart of our understanding of climate change and Earth system science. The entire modeling that we use in everyday computational practices in design is built right on top of models developed in the 60s by James Lovelock, by the amazing work of the Club of Rome in Limits to Growth. It is at the very center, of course, of the entire practice of someone like Buckminster Fuller and the World Games, where you would gather together to plan the planet, reorganizing energy systems, reorganizing locations of cities, reorganizing and reallocating actions and tasks to different populations. The difficulties of those systems, of course, are in the déjà vu. This is a Buckminster Fuller graph, a profile of the International Revolution as exposed by the discovery of elements. And you see the graph growing, like a quick hockey stick. And this was enthusiastically endorsed by architects. It was enthusiastically seen as a possibility of development. So right at the center of that hockey stick is the entire ethos of contemporary architecture, the possibility of departure from long-standing inhabitation tradition. The same hockey stick is today, of course, discussed in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The rise of temperature, the rise of sea levels, the rise of energy consumption, the rise of human population. You see, we've seen this before. We've endorsed it. We tried to plan it. We tried to design it. We actually built it. So to imagine that the conditions through which we have to imagine a facing of this reality from architecture is peculiar, because we've been here before. We've done it. On many levels, we've created the problem, or at least we've contributed to the problem. So maybe we're not really the right place to start thinking of the solution. But yet, that graph is one that is reverberating with other lines, with other cycles. For instance, the amazing discoveries of the cycles of economy, the short business cycles, the slightly longer secular structures, or the Kondratiev curves that so puzzle economists, and the possibilities of governance through supply of liquidity of our contemporary life. The reverberation is really one in contemporary forms of disparity and inequality in capitalism. How are the two connected? Why did we give up the possibility of shaping large organizations of life? Why did we give up that possibility that Jacqueline Turret started? What went wrong? I'm not advocating for a return to it. On the contrary, I want to understand what was wrong in it. How did we get it so wrong and pretended and still pretend that we are the solution? A little graph, maybe to use this opportunity to clarify where we stand. Global energy consumption by humans. This is a graph put together by IASA, the International Integrated Analysis Center in Luxembourg, just outside Vienna. And you start seeing that from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, a few years after this school was established, there's a constant rise globally of how much energy is used by one species. Today, we are around 600 exajoules. There's never been any other species that has had that rise, or the relationship between our body mass and the total energy that we're using is unprecedented. We're talking about 1,000-fold difference between our use of energy and any other moment in the history of our planet. If we take the same chart and look at it in percentage, we start seeing the tragedy of the commons, the fact that we go from one element of energy consumption into the other, and to the other, into the other. We move from a structure based on biomass, basically burning wood, burning coal, into the reorganization of society, into the deployment of very large organizations, parliamentarian organizations, infrastructural, railways, seaways, airways, airlines, in order to organize the supply and demand of the empire. And that's the second curve. And then the rise of oil, with the simultaneous rise of the international, with the rise of the possibilities of negotiation of new territories, with the rise of possibilities of negotiation of new forms of engagement with an economy that has been unleashed from the golden standard. And the contemporary forms leading to our realization that the next transition, the next energy transition, is going to be, for the first time, not one based on extension. We're no longer in a situation of simply extending our practices. In order to support that extension, we should use more energy. We are, for the first time, using awareness in order to change the way that we operate. And this is the difficult part, because the awareness not automatically will lead to possibility of leading evolution, of guiding evolution of our planet. The planet is no longer possible. At the very moment when we realize that through our technologies that we can understand the planet, that we can organize a computational model of how the Earth system operates, we also understand that we are not the major agents. And this is a very interesting inversion. I think it's one of the major challenges in thinking architectural education at such a conjunction. From city-states based on wood to parliamentary states based on coal, to the international based on oil, globalization, again, based on oil, and a little bit of renewables. You might see that the thickness of the bottom line is actually the renewables that we are using. A little thickness of a line. How are we going to transit out of that? The second challenge that our students pose us is really one of how to think, not only how to think an embedded ecological system, which I think is a misunderstanding. You cannot be embedded in an ecology. You can be traversed by the contemporary condition. You can be intruded upon You're never going to be finding a peace in nature. It's no longer the condition of discovering nature in order to somehow design ourselves into it in a peaceful way, because the conditions of nature are as problematic as those of society. So we have a situation of double disjunction. What we thought throughout the 20th century, for a good part of the 21st century, was that we should think with nature in order to be at peace. But at peace, in a situation like that, is an impossible condition to be. On the contrary, you discover more and more conditions of disjunction, contrast, upheaval, controversy. Nobody understands what the others is saying. Actually, if you do try to understand, you don't agree. Everybody's disagreeing with one another. What does it mean to think of the transition in education at the moment when we don't agree, when we can't even listen to each other? What does it mean to think through dark cosmopolitanization processes, through murky evidence of intentions? What does it mean to have an intentionality in a moment when we understand that we are part of a system that is self-regulating? Of course, architecture is a Holocene practice. Architecture developed really during the long, stable periods of the fluvial erosions. The bricks are made out of clay that comes from the sedimentary structures of the large valleys. Architecture is not an Anthropocene practice. Monuments are stable. They align and orient in stability in those vast plains. But those vast plains, let's not forget about it, are not only the site of experimentation in modern architecture in the 20th century. They are also the site of multiple clashes, of multiple wars. It's exactly in those long-established sites and locations of the big fluvial civilizations of the Holocene that we have conducted the major warfares in the second part of the 20th century, after World War II. The wars in the fluvial fields of Korea, of Vietnam, of Cambodia, the strikes along the Nile Valley, the reorganization of polities in the Amazon. It's those very sites that mark the stability of architecture in the long period of stability of the Holocene that we have now engaged in drastically reforming. Those are kilns. That's how you make bricks. You take up the sediment, you dry it or you burn it, you cook it, and then you build amazing monuments. But those plumes are today the plumes of airstrikes, the plumes of terror, the plumes of complete dismemberment of long-standing civilization. How to think architectural history in the wake of this? How to think our responsibility in dismantling 11,000 years of human civilization? The water of those sedimentary processes is all transformed through architectures. Very complicated structures to contain the rivers, to drain lakes, to establish hydroelectric plants, all part of the impetus of modern architecture, all part of the impetus to plan the international, to organize the structures that will sustain independent life. This series of images of the radical transformation in the Mesopotamian structures. In red, you see the vegetation changes during the 15 years of war in Iraq. New forms of politics, new forms of coalitions is the intimation to think this afternoon. How do we establish from architecture new forms of relationships, new forms of integrated access? Today, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is the location of planning the planet. It is the outcome of that space of the international. It is the very epicenter of that space, is that architecture as thought, as the bureaucratization of life. Modernism, for one thing, did this, transformed politics into bureaucracy. The IPCC is nothing else than the epicenter of what we need to surpass. And at the same time, it's the only structure that allows us to understand the complex condition we're in. And this is the puzzling effect. The Anthropocene, the climatic destruction, the ecological crisis can only be understood from within that system. It's an industrial understanding of an industrial destruction. It comes from the structures of remote sensing, it comes from the structures of modeling, it comes from the structures of computation, and also it comes from the structures of complex intergovernmental agreements. And this is the difficulty. How to imagine a condition of exiting, of diversion from that structures when we are all implicated, when we are all part of it, when there's no innocence. In particular, in architecture, there's no possibility of being innocent in this. How do we think let's say, a turning? How do we imagine this turning that many of you are endeavoring to achieve, away from that, without coalescing it, without reverting to the forms and the procedures that have started it all? How do we imagine a politics that is not based on a body politic, where there's no possibility of unifying, but rather is transverse, that is allowing non-human actions, non-human entities to enter the coalitions, to enter the discussion, to enter the transformations? How do we imagine these conditions from an architectural point of view? What does it mean to have a space that is open on all sides? Not transparent, not the glazing of the transparent idea of democracy. How do we organize a space where there's no possibility of centrality, where we are no longer the center, where we're no longer the major actor in the rise of the Anthropocene? Today, negotiations look like this. Small groups, mainly of men, with a few powerful women, around a coffee table. They used to be structured like that. This, 1993. Today, the negotiations are no longer contained in space. They are radiant. We are dealing with a multiplicity of radical transformation of our spaces of inhabitation. We're talking about radiological changes. We're talking about the contamination of our lives, the inspection of the Fukushima plant, or the dismantlement of the architectures of the atomic in Germany immediately afterwards, are spaces that we cannot inhabit normally, that we cannot encounter on a day-to-day basis. We need all kinds of equipment. We need all kinds of apparatuses. We need protection, shields, Geiger counters, remote sensing satellites. We need buoys. We need a number of practices that are at the same time the very means for a continuation of destruction. And this is the difficulty. This is the difficulty of the energy transition. How do we move away from oil? How do we move away into the renewables at the moment when there's no enthusiasm? Not only there's no enthusiasm for the energy system and for the development that we had, but there's also no enthusiasm to actually engage in large coalitions. On the contrary, we are split and individualized. It's so difficult to set up large organizations without remembering the shadows of the 20th century. the same structures that have led us here prefigure alternative pathways towards energy systems. These are 4 different pathways that we can quickly look into. We shall need to keep oil in the ground. That's clear. It's also clear that we can't. At least I can't, unless I change drastically my life. Maybe you should keep oil in the ground. Would you keep oil in the ground without? The question is really one of impossibility, apparently, or of radical rethinking of how we negotiate. And here, maybe there's a little hope about architecture, because architecture still carries that little flame. It is now very feeble, of establishing cohabitation, establishing conviviality. It has become less and less so. It has become more and more about the frontalization of differences, about the extraction of individuality and the proclamation of individuality and distinctions, rather than inclusivity and, let's say, possibility of an ecological thinking. But maybe there's still something that we can do. We could think of a low energy demand in the future. That means that by tomorrow we have to reduce drastically our energy supply. You can see in the image, that means that from tomorrow we have to reduce all our energy back to less than 350 exajoules a year. Are we ready? Do we have the capacity? Do we have the technological capacity to do that? Who's going to give up their energy? Or we can imagine a sustainability process, something that is less demanding, something that is a little bit more challenging maybe than a radical revision of our energy systems, or a radical revision of the efficiency of our civilization, so to say. But that still means that by tomorrow we have to give up oil. Or we can have a middle-of-the-road approach. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. And that means that by the end of this century, we will use around 800 exajoules a year. It's interesting. These are interesting models. They're very complex models. Run through large computing systems, supercomputers that use as much energy as a town of 10, 15,000 people in order to come up with these understandings. I would like to point out that the amount of refuse that is implicated in these middle-of-the-road would imply a complete destruction of our atmosphere, with an intrusion in it of carbon that has been fossil for millions of years, which will then heat the world beyond our fantastically proclaimed goal of 2 degrees, and flood areas through sea level rise that are currently the sites of the rapid urbanization of Africa, the rapid urbanization of the Americas, the rapid urbanization of Asia. 1.5 billion people will be underwater. Around 4 billion people will be directly or indirectly affected by that. Or we could still think that we'll have a fossil fuel-led development, that we'll have to work with the energy molochs of the oil companies and go with their idea and have energy from fossils lead us out through a technological transformation. And you still see here that basically we'll need to plateau our oil consumption for the next 10 years, with enormous consequences on the very foundation of how energy systems operate, and that is the reserve replacement ratio, which is the way through which we have to replenish our reserves in order to attract further investment. We are not talking about energy, we're talking about an intersection of issues. We're talking about finance, international organizations of global supply of aid. We're talking about our pension schemes. We are exposed so much to our structures of extreme consumption of fossil fuels that if we think of stopping, we are troubled. So we have now a conundrum, because if we go on like this, we will be dead. And everything else most probably will be dead. If we stop, we have to change everything. Many people will be dead as well. So we're stuck in this condition of planning the planet. The interesting thing is that contemporary forms of intelligence are abandoned. There's so much intelligence. So the hope is that young people like you will come up with a solution. But I think that more than that, I think that we really have to hope that more than a solution, there will be a polyphony of solutions. There will be a multiplicity of forms of creativity. There will be a poly-creative moment, so to say, which is another challenge for architectural education, which is so much geared with the notion of the self. One planet, one architect, one body. What does it mean to have Gaia, which is a self-regulating system? What is the self in that structure? What are the structures of subjectivity of Gaia? And here's where I think, together with Anne-Sophie, that the structures of territory might help us. In particular, there's a challenge in organizing the notion of territory away from the notion of land, of terra. Territory, on the contrary, is really terrere, to terrorize, to scare off others from what keeps you alive. In material forms, you have to scare off your predator from your food in order to continue surviving. An ecological thinking today means really a territorial understanding of the multiple semantics, the geosemantics, but not only the human semantics, the multi-species semantics. How do we interpret, how do we decipher the hieroglyphs of contemporary forms of life on the planet? How do we engage with this difficulty? The reverberations of territory, of terror, with contemporary conditions are, of course, that, again, we've been there. We've done it before. We have transformed land into a territory. We've created the enclosures in this very land. We've mobilized huge populations away from their habitats. That word of Jacqueline Turret in Dubrovnik. We've created an architecture of mobilization. And we could think that the rise of city-states in Italy, the Renaissance, this idea of good governance, will lead us back to a condition of stability. We could go back to the Holocene. And that might be an interesting and entertaining thought for a couple of minutes. We could even imagine that the construction of a polity needs to somehow resemble pre-industrial societies, in particular the hunter-gatherers, the so-called first peoples. There might be in that a system that allures us, but very quickly you understand that that condition is gone. The only way through which we can understand those contemporary forms of inhabitation are through the industrial organization of extraction. The very same measurements, the satellite images, the scannings, the measurement system that are only possible through the vast machine of contemporary global advanced technological societies. So it's not an issue of feeling and sensing local conditions of the Earth. It's a condition of engaging with an intrusion of that system into our lives. Maybe we can imagine political structures of emphasis, of living together. The amazing elements of many of the European cities. But then immediately we'll have to engage with the long growl of imperial structures, of the plantations. Maybe we can imagine that those plantations have beautiful leaves, beautiful trees under which you can entertain your holidays, but contemporary forms of upheaval. This is Hong Kong, and I would like to send a message to some of our Hong Kong students in this very difficult moment. These are conditions that have radically changed in the wrong places. We built cities in the last 30 years, every single one of them in the wrong place, on the coast. How are we going to retreat? How are we going to build new structures for all of these people away, moving away? We've never done such a thing. We don't imagine architecture as a retreat. We imagine architecture as a construction, going up, not as dismantlement. This is a difficult condition, and it implies also a revision of our aesthetic canons. And usually aesthetics is understood in architecture in a very simple way, that is something that comes to you, and you have to understand the good and the bad of what comes to you. Or if you're a little bit sophisticated, you might imagine that there's an aesthetics in evaluation. But there's a third way through which we could understand aesthetics, and that is through the presentation of, or the gathering capacity, the scientific understanding of aesthetics, and the gathering capacity of those information. Because if there's one thing that this crisis is doing, is that it's gathering. And it's gathering many people in very weird ways. We don't agree on many things, but we still have to come together. And this is, for me, really the major challenge. How do we imagine an architecture where we can come together, be convivial, without having to agree, without having to be embedded, without having to be integrated, without having to be completely summoned within a structure? How do we do that at the same time when architecture is a structure of differentiation, of keeping the others out? And to me, this is where the challenge of a day like today really lies. How do we use a moment like this one to think new forms of coalition that don't require agreement and consent, that don't require even contraposition? How do we imagine these structures? How do we imagine them away from the infrastructural, away from the unconscious conditions that lead us always to think that we have to first build, we have to first destroy the grounds, plow them, array them with cables, pipes, roads? When can we just think of meeting rather than thinking of building a road to travel to meet? When can we start thinking that the very lands that we wish to return to are no longer there? They've dismembered. This is the very first satellite image of the Landsat project, 1972. Of course, it depicts Dallas in Texas. Every single one of those blue marks in 1972 is a man-made water body. Every single one of them. Today, there's not one single river on our planet that is not controlled by man. How do we imagine planning the planet at the moment when the very institutional structures that we think we will need to engage with in order to plan are not interested? On the contrary, are the very means through which we are told that we should stop from that engagement. These are the few elements that I wanted to put forward to you, and reminding us that when we talk about infrastructure, we're not talking about engineers, we're talking about architectures. Now look at this amazing bridge, dike, whatever it is, designed by Cornelis van Eesteren, an amazing architect of the 20th century, with an ambition to form new land. That new land is no longer available. We're not in a situation of a possible new land to discover. The new land that we're discovering today is one that is shaped by intensity, not by extension. Intensification of human activity, intensification of extinctions, and intensification of planning, of design. This is the challenge, I think, that really faces us in a moment like today. I think that we can close it here for today. I would like, before we open for some Q&A, to also invite you back every Monday evening for the continuation of the sessions, the Plan the Planet sessions. But today is really a day of the summit. It's the day through which we can start thinking the radical revision that was set forward in the spring by the letter of Architectural Education Declares on how to engage with rethinking our curriculum. What does it mean to live in a series of schools that so enthusiastically proclaim that they've been at the forefront of architecture for so many decades? What does it mean to establish new coalitions, new polities? What does it mean to think an embedded notion of ecology? What are the aesthetical conditions? We cannot any longer look seriously at the work of Rainer Banham proclaiming the monumentalization of concrete structure, or Le Corbusier's new cities made of concrete. Concrete. That doesn't exist. How do we radically revise our own understanding of what we want? And how do we establish new forms of exchange? I think these are the challenges that you will all engage with, and very happy to see many of you gathered in this amazing room, which we very proudly think is the most important room in the history of architecture. I also think this is the most troubled room in the history of the Anthropocene. Thank you. Q&A. Hello. Hello.
Thank you, John.
I'm John.
Is it on? Yeah. Thank you, John. So now we're going to do the introduction to the different
Before, is there any questions?
There's a hand over there. Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you for your talk today. It's a really interesting lens that you've presented today. I think this is a great opportunity for all people to start talking about this, specifically in architecture. And my question I think relates to the ethics that we generate, because I feel like we focus mostly on the realm of material culture rather than the ecological, the biophysical, which relates to ecosystems and nature. Do you think that maybe looking at the idea of permanence and looking at things that could either disintegrate or stay forever, maybe looking at designs or materials that promote going back to nature or staying forever, could be a solution? I hope it makes sense.
Yeah, maybe we can take a couple of questions before. Are there other questions? Hello.
It's partly a question, but also a comment. What came into my head when you said about the AA being at the forefront is a concept of our society, winner takes all, strikes me as now entirely irrelevant. And I lived in Papua New Guinea for a year in 1970. There was a 7.4 earthquake. Only 30 people were killed because we lived in bamboo houses on stilts. So there is something to be learned in the architect, perhaps in conjunction with the engineer, of relearning to work with what there is. I know where we've damaged it all and all, and there are the thousands of people, millions, where do they? Of course, that's right. But I think there are many moves already, yourself included, in the other direction. That's it.
So the first question is about whether we can think of more long-term structures, if I understood correctly, and whether we can engage in a revision of the distinction between material and immaterial condition in order to understand the biological implications. And the second one, whether maybe that will lead to an aesthetics of renovation and renewal of enthusiasm based on, say, knowledges and societies that we've overlooked. I think that yes, we can look at the long term. I'm particularly fond of the notion of half-life. There's a half-life in our material structures, and that is the way through which radioactive system half. And to think today in long term means that now we are not recycling our activity. If there's one thing that is really crucial in the understanding of contemporary inhabitation of this planet, is that there's one species that is not recycling, but that you could bypass if we were small, if we were a minor species. The problem is that what we don't recycle has now become so vast. Now, we have a hobby, a very strange hobby. We try to measure how heavy cities are, and 30 trillion tons. So the problem in thinking long term is a crucial one, but the problem is really that 30 trillion tons is now a self-organizing system. It's part of Gaia. It's part of the Earth system. It's so vast that it uses so much energy and it consumes so much, but it's not recycling. It's not like a forest. Forests don't drown in leaves. They recycle their materials. They recycle the energy. Our constructions, our objects, our materials, our technologies don't recycle. We're not talking about recycling paper, plastics, and no. We're talking about 30 trillion tons of rubble, of buildings, of cables, of technologies, of infrastructures. 30 trillion tons, just to give you an idea, is around 27 centimeters of gravel everywhere. Everywhere. So, yes, I do agree that we should think long term. And the major issue of thinking long term is one where we could imagine that a condition like a meeting like this one will bring awareness to start modifying Gaia without ever reverting to the possibility of thinking that we're going to influence Gaia directly. And this is the conundrum. We are embedded in a self-organizing planet led by life, as James Lovelock says. And yet we're not the major agent of it. We've unleashed a major condition. We are not the major drivers of it. We are driven by that system. So I do think that there's a major challenge in that. And I do think that it's connected to your comment. I'm very happy to see you back. In thinking different ways of knowledge, how do we organize knowledge? How do we produce knowledge? How do we, and that's at the center of the fact that this is an architectural education element. We're not talking about how to build and how to construct, we're talking about how to learn. And in that learning, being very clear that there's no master. There's no maestro in that learning. We all have to learn. So maybe there's a lot of intelligence that is already out there that we have to learn from. And I really do think that. But I am very, very skeptical of the enthusiasm for their aesthetics about that, which I think is mostly a hardening of the idea, let's say a little punk in us, that will allow us to do some good in building a bamboo skyscraper, but in reality we all know that when we're not seen, we'll do whatever we want. You know, we'll travel, we'll have cities, we'll have tubes, we'll have cars and so on. No? So I'm concerned about that duality. So I think it's a major challenge for an architectural education, not to have one way, but to have a polyphony of ways. And I'm really interested in the conditions through which architectural education could lead to a polycreative society, understanding that we are not the only one forming.
There's another question following on that of interconnectedness, and somehow the more we peer into material structures, the more we peer into what used to be nature, we're starting to realize that we're more and more interconnected in ways that were not direct, and that we're more involved with Gaia in events that could potentially snowball, and that could potentially kind of drive us into unexpected feedback loops. And how would then institutions react to such uncertainty? So the question that we've been discussing internally is also, how does an institution become adaptable? How does an institution take on a challenge like this into how it functions on a day-to-day basis, in terms of how it operates, in terms of its policies?
Yeah, thank you. So it's as usual, you come in with a big question. These are elements for discussion, because we don't have the capacity to imagine that. But there's one element that maybe we could contribute to, and that is the idea that there's, in the Anthropocene, there's an inherent instability. It's not that instability is, say, an exception. There's an inherent instability in the Anthropocene. There's an instability in the concept of the Anthropocene. We don't agree about the Anthropos. Maybe it's the Chthulucene, maybe it's the Capitalocene, maybe it's... No. And the moment that you try to describe it, you immediately cut out the ones that you don't like. I don't like the Chthulucene, I prefer the Capitalocene. No, I really like the plantation scene. And that instability is the really interesting element, that we have so many notions around the current condition that we cannot revert only to one. But at the same time, we know very well that uncertainty is the very foundation of the operation of contemporary politics and contemporary markets. It's the very foundation through which you can imagine the cutting or the shortcutting of investment funds or the hedge funds. The entire operation of contemporary life is based on the calculus of uncertainty. So when we then try to imagine structures that inherently need to be adaptable, it's peculiar that the only way that we can imagine them is that of a market, not that of ecology. Yeah. We'll have, in a few weeks, Emanuele Coccia visiting us for this series, and he talks about the non-human life within us, taking the lead from Lynn Margulis, no? The fact that we are ourselves an ecosystem. You know, we are not only our bodies are an ecosystem, but our societies are an ecosystem. So how do we start really thinking in terms of energy transitions, in terms of material fluxes, in terms of individuation of, without ever reverting to one, to that unification of the body? I think that is the difficult part, both the human body and societal or institutional body. That's where the challenge for, I think it's beautiful that you challenge architectural education, not from within one school, but across the practice.
So I believe this kind of will lead us on to a conversation of ethics and an ethical responsibility that we'll kind of try and explore in the next session. So we're going to have two sessions running parallelly. We have a 10-minute break, after which we kind of reconvene for embedded ecological understanding in this room. John, you've problematized that, and perhaps we'll kind of discuss that in the conversation. And across the corridor in the gallery, we have intersectionality. So it's going to run parallelly, and then for an hour, and then we have two other conversations of articulation of a new politics and decolonization later in the day. So we would kind of like you to join us for that, and thank you all for coming.